They say that having a bad plan is better than having no plan at all, but what if you just really don't have any plan and are just making moves for the sake of it? What differentiates stronger chess players from weaker ones is actually, among many things, the ability of being able to create ideas and plans in the middle game. And that is why, everybody, today I'm going to be telling you exactly what to think about to always have a good plan at hand. Or at least a plan. Now, I want you all to look at this position right here, and I'm going to give you 3 different plan examples. 2 of those are bad, and 1 of them is good. And I want you to try to think about yourselves. You can pause the video and think about what plan you think is the best one. After that, I will explain how you should think in this position and what key characteristics you should have in mind when you're trying to come up with a plan. So, the 3 different ones that I'm going to tell you is first to capture this knight over here so that after the bishop captures back, the bishop is a little bit trapped over here, and well, we're just getting rid of a piece because it's scary, when our opponent has a lot of pieces. The next plan is to go bishop takes e4 because this knight is really strong in this position and we want to get rid of it. So bishop takes e4. And the next plan is to go knight e2. The idea simply being to try to go f3 and kick away this knight instead of exchanging it for any of our pieces. So take a moment to try to think what you think is the best plan over here. You can write it down in the comments if you want to. And now I will tell you how you should think about in this position. When you're trying to come up with a plan, there's a few things that you should always keep in mind. And those are things that, there should sort of be like a checklist when you're playing a game. The first thing is to always try to have your pieces in the best square possible. Now, a good square is a square where the piece is very useful and where it is limiting your opponent's piece's mobility. For instance, this knight over here, we can say, is a really strong piece for white because it's limiting the queen from being able to go to a lot of squares. It's also stopping black from going b6 and trying to get this bishop out because then this pawn on c6 would be hanging. And typically central knights that cannot be kicked away by a pawn, which this one cannot be because both the f and d pawn are, next to it, it's impossible to kick it away, are typically really strong pieces. So this piece is really strong. Now, the next thing we need to think about after thinking about how to place our pieces in the best square possible is how to kick away our opponent's good pieces. How do we make our opponent's good pieces bad? So if we look at this position, our opponent has plenty of bad pieces, but it does have a couple of good pieces. The pieces that are good for black here are this knight over here on e4. This is probably black's best piece. And this queen on h5 because, well, the queen is putting a little bit of pressure towards the king, and the queen is pretty good placed over here. So what does this mean? Okay, knight and queen are the best pieces for black, but this queen is right now still not being too scary, and it's going to be easy to kick it away at some point by maybe going bishop e2. So the piece that we really want to take away over here is this knight on e4. Okay, so bishop takes e4 is then the move, you might think, but actually, we want to try to kick away this knight and force it to move backwards. We don't want to, exchange any of our pieces because our pieces are nice and developed. When we have a possibility of somehow kicking it away, for instance with the pawn, we want to try to kick it away so that it has to go backwards instead of exchanging one of our pieces for that knight. Bishop takes, after a move such as this, we can see that black is able to capture back with the pawn, and now actually we have a little weakness, which is this pawn over here on f4. Now, if we go g3, for instance, well, then we can see that our light squares are going to become very, very weak as we do not have a light squared bishop anymore. So we don't really want to capture over here because we don't want to exchange our light squared bishop for this knight. Instead, we want to kick it away. Now, same thing here. We do not want to capture this knight over here because this is a good piece and this is a bad piece. And we can see here that, we have these double pawns. We will be able to, let's say that we do a random move and, captures and captures. Then we will be having a lot of center. We'll be taking a lot of central squares, and our double pawns will not be doubled anymore. So we are not really that scared of black capturing over here. So we don't want to, capture here. We don't want to do this. Instead, the move and the best plan in this position for white is to go knight e2. The idea is that we are understanding that we want to kick away this knight over here, but we don't want to give black the possibility of capturing our knight. So if we go back one move, if we would go, for instance, f3, then black would have the possibility of going knight takes c3, and then exchange this knight for our knight, and we wouldn't force the knight to go backwards. We want to force the knight to go backwards. So what we do is that we go knight e2, and now actually, white is doing really good now, because what is black going to do? If black now immediately goes something like knight d6, then we're going to go c5. Let's say that black goes knight f6. Well, okay, then we've been able to bring back the knight, and then black will not really have any good piece. So what can black do? Black cannot really go b6, because then this is hanging. Let's say that black then goes ahead and captures on e5. Then we would capture back over here. And then let's say that black goes bishop d7. Then we can go ahead and go c5. And now we can see that this knight has almost no squares to go to. We can also, in this position, the reason why I'm going c5 is because I don't want black to have the possibility to capture over here. So in this position, we've been able to really limit black's mobility, because, like I said, the knight doesn't really want to go back. This bishop cannot develop. And if black captures our central knight over here, then we will get a really nice pawn structure. And let's say that black just does a random move like rook b8. Okay, an idea of rook b8 might be at some point to maybe capture here, and then, maybe being able to go b5 or something. So let's just say that black does this move. So in this position, now that our knight is on e2, we can go f3, kick away this knight, and the question then is, where does the knight go? Let's say the knight goes to d6. This is actually quite similar to what happened in this game, which was one of my games, a rapid game that I played against the 2200. This is very similar to what happened, knight d6, and then we can go c5, and now all of a sudden, let's say, where does the knight go? If the knight goes to f7, it's stopping the queen from going to a lot of places, and there might even be times where we can go knight g3 and, maybe trap the queen. So let's say the knight goes to e8. Just look at the difference in this position that we have been able to create over here from the initial position that I showed you over here. Do you guys see the difference? Simply by understanding what pieces are good and what pieces are bad and how to limit the mobility, we've been able to create a much better position. Let's go ahead and go back to this position with knight e8. You might ask yourself, okay, so we've gotten this position. Okay, how do I continue playing it? Well, first thing to remember from this video, limit opponent's piece mobility. Try to get your pieces as good as possible. The next thing is trying to create weaknesses in your opponent's position. Now, a really good way of doing it is through pawn exchanges. It's actually typically by trying to weaken your opponent's pawns and pawn structure that you're able to create the weaknesses in the position. So, for instance, here, after knight e8, the best way of going forward and the best plan here is to go b4 and b5 to try to exchange this pawn for this one and make the c6 pawn a weakness. Now, why is it so big to create a pawn weakness? Well, if you're able to win a pawn, which there's a higher chance that you'll be able to win a pawn if that pawn is weak, then you'll be a pawn up, and in most endgames, if you're a pawn up, you're winning, at least in many of them. So all of the parts in chess are interconnected in the sense that you play the opening, and hopefully you kind of know what plans the opening that you're playing kind of have. You play the middle game, And then in the middle game, you, through your plans, try to create as many weaknesses in your opponent's position as possible. And then after having created those weaknesses, you win the end game. So that is how, grandmasters and, people that are higher rated, that's how they try to think. So that's kind of the system that you want to go through in your games. So in this position, the best way to continue here would be to go b4. Now, let's say that black goes a6 to try to stop you from going b5. Then you go a4. And this is a really common way of creating a minority attack. So let's say over here, we can see that black just has such terrible mobility of pieces. This is a huge advantage for white. Let's say that black, goes knight c7 to try to stop this. Well, in this position then, what you can do is that you can bring this rook all the way over here. I'm bringing this rook because after we open this up, I want this rook to be in the open file. You can bring this rook on f that's not really doing anything because it's blocked by this pawn. You can bring it over here and then try to go b5. Now let's say that, black cannot go b6 because this pawn is hanging. So what does black do over here? Okay, maybe black needs to at some point capture over here. And in this position, we might want to capture with the d pawn to create this square for the knight. Now, guys, we can see here that a lot of the moves that we're doing, they're, once again, we're trying to create squares that are good for our pieces. So let's say that we do something like this. Once again, our pieces are placed in such good places that, black cannot really, stop this. Like what is black going to do? Let's say that black, here the engine, the best move that the engine is recommending is king h8. Like that is literally like what the engine is recommending. An idea for black would be to go g5. Their center is bad. Their queen side, which is this part of the board, is bad. So the engine is recommending for black to try to go for something like g5. Okay. So what can we do then? We can go for b5 anyways, okay? So we continue our plan over here, and let's say that, white captures. I just want to show you what happens here. Let's say that, there's a lot of captures everywhere. Let's say that black at some point goes g5 just to try to create something over here. Well, then this does not work because we have c6 and this rook is hanging. And if, b6 is really pretty, I believe that there is rook a7 and we're threatening to go c7. And we're activating everything. So you cannot do that. So g5 doesn't work in this position. So what can black do? I'm just, trying to show you how hard it can be for black to create a plan. Let's say that, there's bishop d7. Well, then we can go rook b6. We're stopping this pawn from pushing. And we're going to go knight d4, and we're going to try to double up, maybe put the rook on a7, and then go c6 and just open everything after that our pieces are in the best position possible. This is a way of creating a plan from this initial queen h5 position. By understanding that the most important things are, 1, to limit your opponent's piece mobility, 2, to try to create weaknesses in your opponent's position, which is easier when they cannot really move the pieces. And 3, to try to put your pieces in the best squares possible. Plans, if you start thinking about it, can come a little bit by themselves. They come a lot easier when you have those things in mind. So I'm going to go ahead and show you now another position, which is this one. So I will give you now 3 moves. 2 of them are bad, 1 of them are good. And I want you to think about what you think is the best move out of those. So what is the best plan? So the first plan is to go g5, attacking the bishop and sort of trying to push your pawns towards the opponent's king to try to attack the king somehow. Maybe go h5, g4, and try to break the pawns in front of the king. That is the first idea. The next idea is to go b5, to try to go b4 and exchange this pawn for this one to try to make this pawn a little bit weaker, as it would then have to be recaptured by this pawn, and this pawn would then, after this is captured, not have any other pawn that is defending it. And then the third option that I'm going to give you is to try to move the knight, something like knight e8, knight d6, and then maybe placing it on f5. So those are the 3 options that I'm going to give you. So this idea over here. take a moment, pause the video, and let me know what you think is the best plan over here. So let's go plan by plan. The first plan that I gave you is g5. Now this plan is bad because yes, we are threatening this bishop, but the bishop can simply move and we are going to destroy the pawn structure in front of our king. We don't want to move the pawns in front of our king, as that will really weaken our king, as the pawns are, the defenders of the king. And because, this rook is placed over here, this rook will very easily be able to go to g3. And I mean, this rook will very easily be able to activate itself in front of the king. So this plan would be bad. In this position, what we need to think about is what are the really active pieces and what are opponent's active pieces and what are the pieces that we need to activate. So the pieces that are really active for our opponent are actually several. This knight is a really good knight over here on e5. This bishop is an active piece as well. There might be some ideas of going rook g3 and then trying to capture an h6 because of this pin. So this bishop is pretty active too, which is why someone might think that, okay, you can go g5, but it's not worth it because we're weakening ourselves and we need to make moves that don't weaken our position. And so these pieces are active, and then this rook is pretty active too, but the rook is actually not doing much on e3. The only way that the rook can do something is if it goes to g3, but we can see right now that with our knight on f6, we're actually preventing the rook from coming here because there's knight h5, threatening both the rook and the bishop. And I'm just going to show you that. Let's say that black would make a random move. Let's say we just go rook h8. I just want to show you this, that after knight h5 and this move and captures, we have bishop g5 pitting the rook, and then when the rook moves, we'll be able to win the knight. So that would, not be good. So those are the active pieces that our opponent has. Now, what pieces do we want to make better? Well, actually, our pieces are right now not in the most active squares, but they are developed at least, which is good. And what we want to make sure is that our pieces stay on squares where they can become active soon. So, for instance, the plan of going knight e8 would, one, be a bad plan because white might be able to activate themselves by bringing the rook over here to g3 and start attacking the king, as this knight right here has a really good function of going knight h5 in that case. But two, we want to keep this knight here because then if this knight ever moves, we're going to be able to place our knight up over here on e4. Now, this knight over here on c6, it's pretty good placed because at some point we might be able to exchange this knight for this one if we want to. Because what we can see is that white does never really want to capture back this knight with this pawn, because then this square over here on c5 would be a beautiful square for our knight. So we always need to think about, how do we want our opponent's pawn structure to be? And for us, it would be amazing if the pawn would be here, because then we would have this square for the knight. We would get a beautiful, beautiful path for the knight. So at some point, we might be able to capture an e5, and actually capturing right now on e5 is a good plan as well, but it's very similar to the plan that I think is the best here, so I'm not really going to go through it as it's going to transpose pretty much. So the best idea here in this position is to go b5, and the idea of b5 is to go b4, and just like before, try to exchange this pawn for this one to create a weakness in the opponent's pawn structure. If we're able to exchange this pawn for this, and this pawn is gone, we can see that all of a sudden, this pawn doesn't have any pawn that is defending it, which means that it's going to be easier to attack it. All pawns that don't have a pawn that's defending it are much easier to attack. So, and we can also see that, if the pawn would capture the pawn over here, then this pawn would become a great weakness. So actually, this is also one of my games. The game continued with b5, and here white captured the knight on c6. I was once again playing as the 2200 player. Now here I captured back, and my opponent went a3. The idea was to stop me from going b4 and exchanging this. Now, even in this position, let's say that, my opponent would have gone something random like king h1, I would still have gone probably, maybe I would have prepared it. I would have gone queen b7 maybe first and prepared b4, but at some point my opponent would have had to go a3, because let's say they make another random move and I'm able to go b4, I might be able to put this rook over here on b6, and very soon I will be attacking a lot of my opponent's pawn weaknesses on the queen side. So that was why my opponent went a3 in this position, and I went queen b7 with the idea of opening up this file for my pawn so that I could go a5 and b4. I am just playing for the one idea because I know that this side of the board is controlled as my knight on f6 is stopping the rook from going over here, so there is no attack for white right now. So in this position, my opponent went bishop e5 to try to get rid of this knight because they were so annoyed of the fact that my knight could go to h5 at any point to stop this. So now it's crucial that now that this position changes, okay, now that this position changes, my plan needs to be flexible. I'm not going to continue going a5 and just say, I don't care what my opponent does, I will continue with my plan. No. It's important to understand that plans are flexible and you continue with the plan and you keep that same plan in the back of your head, but when your opponent makes a move that kind of changes things, you need to maybe go for a new plan for a little bit. So after bishop e5, I decided to go knight d7 because I knew that either the bishop stayed here and I had, the bishop would have to go back to f4 and then I would be able to continue with my plan, or, I would be able to capture this bishop. And I understood that if I'm able to capture this bishop, I knew that if this pawn takes, and I thought that I was going to have a really nice pawn structure because I would be able to get a little bit more of center. Now, I wouldn't have a knight that was able to go to c5, but even placing a bishop on c5 if this pawn was over here would be really good because this diagonal would be fantastic for me as this rook is in this diagonal, and we might even be able to put some pressure on this f2 pawn. Now, the rook captures, then I was thinking that this bishop on this diagonal, maybe together with the queen, would be able to become really strong as my opponent doesn't have any dark square bishop, so I'd be able to dominate the dark squares of this position. Now, I thought that bishop f4 was the best move, but my opponent went queen d1. So my opponent really started focusing on trying to create some sort of kingside attack. Now here, I captured on e5, and after rook takes e5, I went bishop d6, which was the plan that I talked about, placing my bishop over here. Now here, my opponent went for rook e2, and now I continue with my previous plan of going a5 to then go b4. Now we can see that my opponent right now, if we just look at this position in comparison to what we had after this move, which was the initial move that I showed you, we've tried to exchange the pieces that are good of our opponent to take them away, because if we take away our opponent's good pieces, they're only left with the bad ones, which means that they get a worse position. And we've been able to create a lot more weaknesses. So, not yet, but, the next move I'm going to go b4, and then we're going to start creating the weaknesses. So let me just show you what happened after b4. My opponent captured on b4. I captured back. And, my opponent didn't want to capture over here because then I would be able to go rook b6 because I want to capture with the rook, actually. So my opponent here went c4. But now all of a sudden, we have a new weakness. Guys, chess games, they're long. You're always trying to come up with new weaknesses. So instead of, my opponent wanted me to go rook b6 and capturing here, my opponent went c4. And now I need to capture because otherwise my opponent is going to go c5. And this pawn is going to become what we call a protected pass pawn, which are amazing in endgames because they will always be passed, which means that there's no pawn that can stop them. But they're also protected, so they're not a weakness. So I need to capture here. I did that. And after knight takes c4, I went bishop c7 because I felt like my bishop was better than this knight. And also my opponent was threatening to go knight a5. So I wanted to stop the knight from going here because this would be a fork. And after this, we can now see that the new weakness in this position is this pawn. We've done all of this, and I know it looks really complicated, but we've done all of this to create this isolated pawn as a weakness for white. So now the whole game will be for me to try to block this pawn, placing a piece over here, try to block it, try to win this pawn, and then try to win the endgame. That is what this game is going to be about at this point. So I'm going to show you how the game continued. The knight went to e5, and I went rook d6 to attack this pawn. And then my opponent went rook e4, and I went rook d5 because I wanted to keep this rook over here to then double up the rooks. And right now, I'm also taking away the block of this bishop. I want the bishop to be in an open diagonal. And I mean, we are the ones that are better. Black is definitely better in this endgame because white is going to have to spend a lot of time defending this pawn. So I will just show you how it continued. Knight d3, and I was able to go rook f8. And I mean, at this point, my opponent just, couldn't really defend here. So they ended up capturing on b4. Queen takes, knight takes. I took on d4. And now we have an endgame. Now we have an endgame as there's only the rook and bishop versus rook and knight left. But here we have another thing. Yes, it's equal material. Yes, this is, we haven't been able to win this pawn. But this pawn is going to be a weakness now, actually. And typically in endgames, rooks and bishops work a lot better than rooks and knights, which was something that I knew when I played all of this. So I was trying to exchange my bad pieces for their good pieces. So I was able to keep the bishop and the rook in the endgame, which is a slight advantage. Obviously, if you're, 800 rated, this might not make a big difference, but in just the terms of what is good, this is a pretty good way of doing it. So here I can just show you that my opponent went knight a2, and then I was able to go rook d2. This was a really big mistake. This should have gone knight c2 probably, but or even just maybe like gone somewhere else. But maybe, no, sorry, knight c6 or knight a3-6 I think was better. But now I was able to go rook d2, and if my opponent went something like rook b1 to defend, their pieces would become very passive, and I'd be able to go bishop here, and I'd end up winning this pawn, or I would also be able to maybe simply go bishop b6 and threaten this pawn. So, I mean, bishops and rooks work so well in endgames because they complement each other very well. Both are long-range pieces, which means that they're pieces that, that are able to go to very far squares, which means that they complement each other very well because they can attack basically the same squares. Knights and rooks don't complement each other so well because rooks are long-range pieces, but knights are short-range pieces, which means that they can only go to squares that are pretty close to the square that they're already in. So, if this rook wants to attack over here, it's going to take a while for this knight to be able to attack this square. So that's why they don't work really well together. So, yeah, I'll just show you very quickly what happened. But after after rook d2, my opponent went king f1, gave up the pawn. I was able to capture here, and I kept my pieces. I knew what I was doing pretty much in the endgame. I was just trying to place my pieces in as good squares as possible, and I ended up winning a piece in the endgame. And once again, this is a rapid game against a 2200 player. So I ended up just winning this. I think they were signed over here. So what I wanted to show you was just ways that you can come up with plans in positions that seemingly look quite equal during middle games. Now, in the best of worlds, you know what plans to have in the opening, you know what plans to have in the end games, but it's especially in the middle games where you need to figure out what ideas to come up with and what plans to do. So I hope that this was instructive in trying to come up with plans, and remember the key ideas of improving your pieces, creating weaknesses in your opponent's pawn structure, in general in your opponent's position, but the easiest way is in your opponent's pawn structure, and in trying to limit your opponent's piece mobility as much as possible. If you're able to go for those three things, then you're going to go very far, and it's going to become a lot easier to come up with plans in the middle game. So I hope that you guys enjoy this. Let me know if you want me to do this again with different positions. If you have any questions, anything, let me know in the comments down below. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed it, and I will see you all in the next video. Thank you so much for watching, everybody.